Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm Rosa, and if this is the first time that you're seeing my face, then welcome. It's so nice to have you here on the channel. We made it to book number 10 out of 10 in Neville's book collection. If you've been with me since the first book in this series, I want you to leave me a fire emoji in the comment section down below. And if you haven't, then go ahead and watch book number 1 to 9 before you come over here to the last book in Neville series, because this is going to be my summary, my breakdown, and my interpretation of Neville Goddard's 10th book called The Law and the Promise. Now, if you've been here up to this point and you're wondering, I'm in a new location, that's because I actually just moved back to my house in Toronto. I was in Florida for a couple months, just living my best life, doing some work over there and enjoying the nice hot weather before coming back to the freezing Toronto, Canada. So that's why the location has changed if you're curious. But let's get right into Neville Goddard's 10th book. Now I'm just gonna get cozy for this one because it's a bit of a long one. Okay. Chapter 1 is called The Law, Imagining Creates Reality. Now, Neville Goddard shares a lot of stories in this book to show the actual practical application of the law in his teachings, which first of all, I think that the stories are really, really helpful because, it's one thing to learn about the law, it's one thing to hear about it, to study it, but it's another thing to hear practical examples and stories and successes and to actually experience the results in your own life. So I'm not going to be, reading every single story in this video, but I do just want to point out and say that if you are someone who's a little on the fence about the law, you're still curious about how the law works or how the law could work for you, it'll be so important to, number one, hear other people's successes, but number two, actually practice this law for yourself consistently, actually take into application into your real life these tools and witness the experiences in your own life, because that's truly the only way that you're going to get this law solidified in your belief system and have it work faster for you, easier for you, etc. So yeah, not going to be sharing all those stories, and it's actually one of my really big goals for the next upcoming months to start sharing more of my personal story when it comes to manifestation, more things I've personally manifested, bring more of me into my content, because I know it's very teachy and I do like being a teacher. It's a role I love to turn on and go into, but I also really want to bring a lot of my personal stories and examples into my videos because I know, being a student myself, that I learn best when I hear people's practical examples being shared. So just wanted to throw that out there as well. Stick around, subscribe if you haven't, because I will be sharing more personal stories of the way the law has worked in my life, in my clients' lives, in my family's lives, my friends' lives, everyone I share the law with has seen massive successes in their life. So I definitely want to bring that more into my content and share that with you guys. But anyway, this chapter is all about imagination. And he says that man is all imagination. And imagination itself, the aspect of us that is imagination, is God, is the higher power. We all have the higher power. We all have God living within us. If you've listened to the other books, this shouldn't be anything new. Now, he says here what we were just kind of talking about, which is that the claim that imagination creates reality is proved by its performance. It's not proved by hearing about it, learning about it, studying about it. No, it's proved by you actually implementing the teachings, seeing its results and reaps in your life, and then coming to your own conclusion on realizing how the law works and how it works for you, right? This is something I've learned, particularly myself when it comes to this manifestation journey, is that it works slightly different for each of us. We are the creators of our own reality, and therefore we're gonna have different experiences because we've all have different lives. We all have different views that we view this life through the perspective of. So it's up to us to take these teachings and make them our own, right? We're not Neville Goddard. We are our human vessel. Whoever you are in this life is who you are in this life. That is your body. But we also all have that source within us, the God that lives within us that is not attached to our form, not attached to our body. But the thing is, we all have our bodies. We all have our personal limitations and personal experiences that shape our current view of reality. So we need to be able to work with that, right? We need to get to know ourselves, our body. Who are we in this life? Who is this human shell that we are experiencing, this body we're experiencing? And implement the teachings in our own life in our unique way that works for us, that works for you, okay? He says, this world is a world of imagination. Nothing appears or continues in being by a power of its own. Every single event that happens in our physical world only happens because our imaginal activities created them. Imagination creates everything. Although it looks like the 3D world, external world is causing things, Neville's saying, no, no, no. Everything originates in our consciousness, in our imagination. When you become aware of what you're imagining, you become aware of what you're creating. Now, every single man has an imagination, but an awakened imagination, he says, has a purpose. And that purpose is to create a desirable reality and destroy the undesirable. And because everyone has this ability to create life through their own imagination, we must take this power and become conscious creators of our reality. But what happens is, since man generally does not know or understand the depth and the truth of this law, the power of this law is asleep within them as though dead. Because when you don't exercise or put into practice this law, just like a muscle, he says, it will atrophy, it will weaken, right? He says, to man whose imagination is as real as the forms of nature, if we can get ourselves to feel like what's going on up here is just as real as what's going on out here, that person is the master of his fate. Nothing can take your ideal from you unless you fail to persist in imagination. And how do we do this, he says? The secret is in self-abandonment. And what he means by this is abandoning your past self and mentally live in the new state of your wish fulfilled. And not just live in the wish fulfilled, but this is a super important point, is to feel the love that you would feel if you were living in your wish fulfilled. He says, because you cannot commit yourself to what you do not love. In order to create a new future for ourselves, we must be able to use our imagination for that, right? Because the future, technically, has not yet existed for us in our conscious mind in this human vessel that we're experiencing. The future is non-existent, or it has not yet come into our physical 3D experience, right? Our past, however, we could consider as a real event that has happened because it is stored in our memory. But Neville says that our memory of the past, as well as our imagination of the future, they're both figments of imagination. The past is not existing in this moment, therefore it's not really real. The future is not existing in this moment, therefore it's not really real. Both are creations of our imagination. Because even when we do think back on a past experience that has happened, it's usually altered, it's usually tampered with, it's usually very different than the event that actually happened. Memory is not real either if we're looking at it by that logic, right? So if we're constantly creating our future based on memories of the past, we're not creating a new future for ourselves. We're using our imagination to ruminate on the past, and therefore we're creating and perpetuating the old story again and again and again. However, we are creatively transforming when we imagine things as they ought to be. We're building a world out of our imagination rather than out of memory of what has been or predicting what will happen based on the future. No, Neville's saying use your imagination to expand beyond things that you're familiar with in the familiar past. You have the power to expand your awareness beyond what is familiar to you, right? Of course, our brains want the familiar. Our brains find it easy to go back to the familiar past, to recreate the same experience over and over again, because then our brains don't got to do any work, right? But that's why it takes this initial mental discipline to keep our mind in the life that we're creating, to imagine an ideal that we would like to experience and keep our focus there. Keep our mind in what we would like to create. This imagination, this reality we want to experience is never existed before, right? We're creating it basically out of nothing, out of thin air, right? So we need to stay persistent in that in order to change our story, to no longer be repeating the same cycles of the familiar past and actually live in a new reality that we are creating by our own imagination. Because either way, we're creating from imagination. But is our imagination constantly in the past and thinking what's going to happen in the future is going to be the same as the past? Then guess what? That's exactly what's going to happen. You're going to keep recreating the same stories over and over and over again that are the same as your stories that you've carried of yourself and of life in the past. This is how we change it, through the altering of where our imagination is focused in. This is a really interesting point that Neville says here. He says, there's actually no difference between a present sense and fact of this moment, like something that's happening in the 3D right now, and a memory. He's saying there's no difference because both exist in imagination. Let's see, let's read further what he's saying here. The difference that makes this moment feel so real to us is that we're imagining from the perspective of what's going on here. But when we're thinking of a memory, we're thinking of it. When we're thinking of a wish, we're thinking of something in the future, we're thinking of it. So he's saying that everything's imagination, past, present, and future. The only thing that makes this moment feel so real is that we're thinking from it. We're experiencing it now. So he says in order to make that future become a present reality, we don't just think of it as it's in the future. We gotta bring it to this moment and think from it. Make the future the present, and then that future will manifest itself actually in your world, because he says where man is in imagination, he has to be in the present moment. To change your now, you must move your perception from current events that are happening now, which are all imagined anyway, and think from a new reality. And that's what calls the experience towards you. That is the only way that it can be birthed. He then gives a little prompt to the reader here to imagine yourself to hold a rose. Imagine you're holding a rose. Imagine you're smelling that rose, right? Try to take on all the imagery and the sensory impressions that would imply. Like you're holding a rose, you feel maybe some thorns around it, you're smelling it, you're looking at it. If the rose is not actually physically here, then how can you sense it? And this is what he calls spiritual sensation. This is imaginal sight, imaginal sound, imaginal scent, taste, and touch. All of our senses. We can use our senses in our imagination. And he says that when you think about your desires, you want to give your desires sensory vividness. Imagine in your imagination, in your mind, that you're not only just thinking of your desire, but what would it feel like? What would your senses actually feel if your desire was here? What would be around you? What would the room smell like? What would it taste like? What would it look like? What would it sound like? What would people be saying to you, right? These are just ways that you could get your senses involved in an imaginal act, calling it towards you quicker, faster, and more effectively, he says. He says, if you could do this, all things will conspire to get you to your goal, and at the end, when your goal is realized, you will see the subtle threads that led to your goal. You could never have devised the means. There's nothing that stands between you and your fulfilled desire except for quote-unquote facts of the senses. But even facts, he says, are just creations of imagination. Chapter 2 is called Dwell Therein. He says to dwell therein means to live in a certain state. The problem is that men live in an undesirable state a majority of the time. So what happens is because they're living in this state, they're dwelling in an undesirable state of being, they continue to produce and perpetuate more of the same problem, more of the same state that they continue to dwell in. You're always going to recreate and perpetuate who you are conscious of being. Who do you see yourself to be? How do you view life to be? What does this circumstance look like in your life? However you see it is how it's going to continue to show up. You must first change the way you see things. Change the state that you are living in dominantly all the time in order to see real changes, because it's not just about thinking something once or twice. It's about persisting in the new way of thinking, the new way of believing, the new way of seeing life, the new way of seeing yourself, the new way of seeing the people around you, the new way of seeing this specific circumstance, that specific circumstance. Whatever you desire, you need to first see it in imagination and persist in that story to see the changes in your state of being and therefore in your life. He says you control your future by controlling imagination. Live in the wish fulfilled, and then a bridge of incidences will naturally lead you to your desire. He says that men are either adopting the way of imagination or the way of the sense. There's no compromise or neutrality that is possible here. Right? So he's saying man is either viewing his life through imagination, creating his life through imagination, which is creating a new outcome, a new story for himself, or he is living and perpetuating and only seeing the evidence of his senses, which will keep him perpetuating and recreating the same old story again and again and again, right? He's saying there's no in between here. You're either living from the senses or you're living in imagination. At every moment, we get to choose which state are we dwelling in, the true reality of imagination or dwelling in the world of the senses. When man finally identifies himself with his imagination rather than his senses, he has at last discovered the core of reality. He says, imagine better than the best that you know and create a better world for yourself and for others. Because imaginal acts, not blind fate, determines the course of history. Chapter 3 is called Turn the Wheel Backwards. Now this chapter is about revision and turning the wheels of time back. He says that man and his past are one continuous structure, meaning all of your past events become facts about who you are today. You carry these facts over and over and over again every single day, and these facts, they seem unalterable, right? They seem like this is just who you are. But the thing is, when you continue to perpetuate this old story of who you are, it will continue to perpetuate in your life. He says the past is still existing now because all is happening at once. So the past continues to give the man results of the past. But as Neville says, we don't need to be victims of our past. We actually have the ability, with his technique called revision, to go back in our own memory, seek for and destroy the causes of all evil. He says when we do this, when we go back into our imagination, into the past, and change the way an event went down, this results in repeal. He says to go into imagination, go into that scene that caused you so much distress and replay it over and over and over again the way that you wanted it to have gone. Changing your life means changing the past. All of the present evil is a result of unrevised scenes of the past, and any alteration of the past will alter the present and the future. So he says that revision can revise a scene that otherwise would be seen as unchangeable. And he says that because man is all imagination, the man himself, who is imagination, he's not the state that he lives in, because the state that he lives in is changeable, right? We can always change the state that we're in. But the core of our being, our imagination, that doesn't change. The core of who we are does not change. The I am essence, the God within us, that does not change. However, our circumstances can change, right? Even something that does not seem like it's changeable is incredibly changeable. Anything that seems like an unalterable fact, he says to remember that imagination creates everything. So whatever imagination can make, it can unmake. So when it comes to revision, revising the past is to reconstruct the past with new content using our imagination. He says that it's an incredibly important practice to daily, as we drift off to bed, relive our day as we would have wished to have lived it to conform to our ideals. So, if you get to the end of your day and your day didn't really go as planned, Neville says before you go to bed, before you drift off to sleep, to mentally rearrange your day, to go back in your day, keep your focus on seeing in your imagination as if your day went exactly as planned, and get into that feeling state, because when you do that, when you change the past with your imagination, you then change your future. You change the timeline that you're on. He gives the example of writing a letter. So if you would have wished to receive a letter from someone, or let's say you got a letter of bad news, or you got a bad check, or you got whatever, right? A text message. He says to revise the letter or rewrite the letter, or if it's a text in modern day, rewrite the text over and over and over again in your mind, and pretend that the letter said something completely different. Do this over and over again to arouse the feeling of naturalness. Because imaginal acts become facts as soon as we feel the naturalness of the act. He says our past and our present continue to exist only because they are sustained by imagining on some level or another. And a radical transformation of life is always possible by man revising undesirable events and letting it go, right? So we need to let go of the senses. What are the senses telling us? What is the evidence of the senses telling us? In order to let go of the senses, that requires us to let go of control, right? And that's not really an easy task, because we are beings biologically run by our need to want to control things, right? For our survival, right? That is in our human nature. But as humans, we also have another aspect to us that is beyond our senses. We have imagination, we have consciousness, right? This is beyond what animals have the ability to do. We have the ability to create worlds through our consciousness, right? That is what makes us creators. So of course, this is going to be a constant practice that we develop, but this is what Neville is saying is what it takes to become the master of your fate. So chapter 4 is called There Is No Fiction. He says here, there is no such thing as fiction. All things existing are purely imaginary. So if an imaginary activity can produce a physical effect, then our physical world must be essentially imaginary. To prove this would require that we observe our imaginal activities and watch to see whether or not they produce corresponding external effects. So we need to take into our own hands, into our own account, to test out this law for ourselves, see if once we start paying attention to our imagination, start to see the correlation, start to see how things in your reality are just producing to you things that you assume to be true. He says, today's imaginal fictional drama becomes tomorrow's fact. And the cause of every outcome is always mental. It is not a physical cause. He says once again here to imagine only the best imaginable. He says here that we are all, every single person is a prophet and a psychic. And before I even read Neville's work, I kind of tapped into this kind of idea already in my own way. But he says that the function of prophets is not to tell us what is inevitable, but to tell us what can be built up out of persistent imaginal activities. The future is determined by imaginal activities of humanity. So the way I think of it is like there are infinite potential realities, right? And a psychic or a prophet is telling you one of those potential timelines based on your current state where you are right now. So it's really just affirming your own intuition of a reality that you should already know to be true, right? And this is why I'm not a big fan for going to because what it does is when you hear someone externally to you who claims to be a psychic say, you know, this is 100% going to happen to you in your life, your subconscious takes that in, right? You are then believing and assuming that this is going to be your reality, therefore creating it, which of course is amazing if it's a beautiful prediction. But what if someone gets bad news and then they're constantly fearing this bad news and they're expecting it to come and it's being anticipated? Well, they are then creating it with their consciousness because they expect this to be the reality. Even if they don't fully believe in psychics, but that seed has been planted, they're kind of like looking for it, you know? So this is why when I hear a message I don't like or resonate to, I'll just say, I do not affirm. You know, I know that infinite potential realities exist, and I get to choose which of these timelines I'm tapping into by my persistent focus in that specific state, area, or desire of mine. We're all psychics. We're all prophets. I could say, I know for 100% fact that XYZ is going to come to me next week, but I know that because I'm creating it for myself, not because it's a destiny that is written out 100% and can't be changed. We can always change our destiny by using our consciousness, using our creator ability, but we need to first know that we are the creator. The creator is within us. We have that power within us to choose our direction, to choose our timeline, to choose our desire, and walk with the knowing that every single step that we take, everything that we do is leading us to our desire. Because we already feel like our desire's here. We are tapped in, we are in that knowing of this is just my life, right? So that was my little rant about psychics. I have a lot of psychic friends, love psychics, but that is just my perception on it, is that when someone is tapping into a future prediction, a future timeline, that's exactly what it is. It's a future potential timeline. And I feel like any good psychic will tell you this is not 100% set in stone, but this is a potential timeline if you continue going down the path that you are going down currently. Okay, just wanted to say that. Chapter 5 is called Subtle Threads. So in this chapter, he says that nothing appears or continues in being by a power of its own. Imaginal activity creates everything. Now, the notes I have for this chapter is very short, but basically what he says that subtle threads are like the bridge of incidents, right? It's the subtle threads, the subtle movements that are happening that we don't see physically. When you're tapped into a desire that you want to manifest and you are locked into this desire, you number one desire it, you persist in the knowing, you persist in the thoughts, you persist in embodying right now, looking at life through the perspective of having that thing. He says there is a bridge of incidents or subtle threads, subtle movements happening that we cannot physically see, that the universe is, pulling together, pulling the subtle threads, the subtle strings, and bringing everything together. Our higher self, our subconscious mind is doing the work for us to piece together, create the bridge of incidents that will lead you from where you are to where you desire to be, right? It's not up to us and our conscious mind and our conscious efforts to see how exactly we're going to get our desire. It's up to us to simply have faith, trust, and know that a bridge of incidents or subtle threads are happening behind the scenes that are going to inevitably get us to our desire. He says it's only when you get to your goal, only when you get to the desire that you will see the subtle threads that led to your goal that you would not have been able to piece together yourself, right? This is divine intervention at play over here. You personally could never have devised the means. That's why it's so important for us to let go of our senses, our logic, what we think we should do, right? It's not about what we think we should do. It's about being able to let go and trust that once we plant the seed, once we think from the end, that we know it's going to come. And this again is a practice, but the more you do it, the more you strengthen your own belief in the law, the more you're going to see the results and the subtle threads that bring you towards your desire. Chapter 6 is called Visionary Fancy. Now, visionary fancy is just his way of saying imagination. Okay, so we're just going to say imagination to keep this simple. So he says the images of our imagination are the realities of which any physical manifestation is only the shadow. So this is interesting. He's saying that our imagination is the real reality, and the physical things in this world, the manifestations, that's just a shadow of the real reality, which is the opposite of what a realist would say, right? This is the opposite of what someone who lives by their senses would say, which is that this is real life. Real life is physical, and our imagination is an illusion. Our imagination is not the real reality. But Neville's saying that's not the truth. The truth is that our imagination is the real reality. There is such a greater dimensional of life that exists beyond what we physically see, that we must remain faithful to the real reality of imagination, remain faithful to the vision, and then the image will create for itself the only physical manifestation of itself, right? So what other people call as a physical reality, an imaginist would call this unreality or a shadow of true reality. He says, through spiritual sensation, through your use of imaginal sight, sound, scent, taste, and touch, you will give your imagination the sensory vividness necessary to produce that image in your outer or shadow world. When you are so sure that your reality is your imagination over what's happening in the 3D, you create your 3D. The physical world is just a shadow. So when you hear something in your 3D world that you don't like, you can just say, that's not what I heard you say, right? And he gives personal examples of people doing this, hearing one thing from a person and then mentally saying to themselves, nope, you didn't just say that. You didn't just say no to me. You said yes to me, right? And then continuing in that mental assumption. They're not doing anything in the 3D to be like, cause a problem and say, you didn't say that to me. They're just saying in their head, oh, okay, thank you. You didn't say that to me though. Right? In their mind, they're saying that. And then just countless stories that he shares of them later finding out that either the person lied or they just didn't know the truth or they changed their mind, like whatever it is. When you in imagination first hear what you want to hear, reality is going to conform to your imagination. Our imagination has these subtle threads, these bridge of incidents that just happen without effort. We're putting too much effort into the 3D. That isn't even going to reap the results that we want, because we're not focusing at the cause, we're focusing on the effect. Chapter 7 is called Moods. He says, men regard their moods far too much as effects and not sufficiently as causes. He said, moods are just imaginal activities which without no creation is possible. So a lot of times we'll say that we're happy, we have a happy mood because we achieved our goals. But we don't realize that the process works equally well in the reverse direction. We shall achieve our goal because we have assumed first the happy feeling of the wish fulfilled. So here he shares a story of a woman who has absolutely nothing to lose in her life. Like she was homeless, she had no money, she just had a bunch of circumstances that were really, really working against her favor. And she felt like, I have nothing to lose. I'm going to put my all into Neville's Law, into using my imagination to creating a life I desire. Now, of course, she had barely anything to her name, to her life. So she just repeated this one phrase, instead of because she could have, taken on a billion affirmations. I need money. I need this. I need a home. I need food. I need love. I need support. I need this. I need that, right? She could have, I need a job. I need this. I need that, right? She could have gone into detail on the things that she desired. But Neville gave her this one phrase to use, that one phrase that is, isn't it wonderful? Now, I'm sure you guys have heard it, and the purpose of saying, isn't it wonderful, is basically to imply and to catch the feeling of wonderful things are just always happening. When you say to yourself, isn't it wonderful? Isn't it wonderful? What emotion does that bring up in you, right? I mean, I personally don't say, isn't it wonderful? Because it doesn't feel like a natural thing, I would say. I don't know how many people nowadays are just like, isn't it wonderful? Like, it doesn't sound like a very natural thing to say. What I personally like to say is, I have everything. Everything goes my way. My life is perfect. Everything is just always working out for me. Like, I just get everything I desire. Like, that is my all-encompassing statement that I would substitute instead of Neville Goddard's, isn't it wonderful? That's just my personal process. But regardless, the idea is the same. The idea is that it implies that you have everything. That isn't it wonderful? Isn't it amazing? Isn't it wonderful that I have everything I desire? Isn't it wonderful that everything good is happening in my life, right? And the kind of the point of this is that we're not conditioning, isn't it wonderful that blah, blah, blah. No, it just, isn't it wonderful? Life is just wonderful. Like things are just happening for me. Everything, not just one thing. I'm not conditioning it at just money, just relationship, just a house, just whatever. No, everything, right? So this is really the point, is to really catch that feeling of that mood, right? That mood of things are just wonderful. Things are just beautiful. Anyway, so what happened? Everything unfolded for this woman wonderfully. She felt the way that she would feel as if things were really wonderful. And she repeated this imaginary action and feeling for 2 months, night after night after night, every single night, catching the feeling of, isn't it wonderful? Isn't it wonderful? Just to give some examples of some things that happened to her is she got a random check in the mail for $2,500 from a random friend that she has not heard of or seen from in 25 years. And that friend all of a sudden became super wealthy and decided to share with her a lot of money every single month for 2 years, covering all of her expenses and also leaving enough room for her to buy things that she desired, like a car, like clothes, like an apartment, and so much more, right? So this is an example of like, she didn't have to do anything for this, right? It just came into her life without effort. She literally just said, isn't it wonderful? Isn't it wonderful? Isn't it wonderful? And all of a sudden, absolutely every single wonderful thing that she could have never even thought of or imagined started happening in her life. The universe, the subtle threads, the bridge of incidences had to make a way for her imagination, for her mood to manifest itself in her reality, right? What made this friend who she hasn't heard of in 25 years decide to give her a large chunk of wealth every single month for years? What compelled him to do that, right? And the answer is her imagination. He says the boundless opportunities opened by recognizing the shift of focus of imagining are beyond measure. There are no boundaries. There are no limits. So what I love about Isn't It Wonderful is that you're not placing caps. You're not placing limits on what you could receive, right? You are opening yourself up to limitless, wonderful things happening. Now, we often manifest things, right? We want to manifest a specific thing, a specific desire, specific person, specific amount of money, specific house, whatever, right? We're trying to manifest things. We're trying to manifest situations. But how about manifesting moods? How about manifesting the feeling of being happy, of being content, of feeling full within ourselves right now? We can manifest states. We can manifest moods. And that is what Neville's saying here. And you know, the interesting thing is if we do manifest that mood, we do manifest that feeling of amazingness, of isn't it wonderful, we're then attracting things that are in alignment with that mood, with that feeling. A man does not need to wait for the uprising of new moods within himself. He can create happy moods at will. So chapter 8 is called Through the Looking Glass. He says normal consciousness is focused on senses and restricted to those senses, interlocked with his environment. But the man of imagination is not a tenant to his brain, but he is the landlord of his brain. We're not just taking in all the impressions that are placed upon us. No, I am the creator here, honey. I decide what my reality is going to consist of. I'm not just going to accept anything that is presented to me in my 3D world. Man does not need to accept the appearance of things. He can go beyond the perception of the senses. He has the ability to pass through the structure of the senses, and this is the most important discovery that man can make. This is what will enable him to alter the course of observed events, moving from success to success through the series of mental transformations in himself. He says it is possible to pass from thinking of to thinking from. Now, thinking from means actually experiencing the state and being unified with the state. I am the state. I am this version of me. Whereas thinking of means there is always two aspects, right? There is me, the subject, who I am, and the object, the thing that I'm thinking about. Thinking of them as separate, right? We are not unified. So in order to unify ourselves with our desire, we must think from our desire. We are our desire. We are living life through the looking glass of having our desire rather than thinking of our desire and being separate from it. He said once again, he reiterates here that the secret is in self-abandonment, abandoning ourselves to the state desired, feeling the love of that state, and live the life of that state, and no more living in our present state. Faith plus love is self-commission. We cannot commit ourselves to what we do not love. And in Wisdom 11:24, it says, never would you have made anything if you had not loved it. In order to make a state actually become alive, you must become it. We must be the state to experience the state. Man must be where he is in imagination. He then gives another very interesting story that proves that it's possible for an individual to transfer the center of imagining to some greater or lesser degree to a distant area, and not only do so without moving physically, but to be visible to others who are present at that exact point in space-time. Basically, what this story was there was this woman who was sitting in her living room in San Francisco, and she imagined in this, I guess, deep state of meditation that she was in her daughter's living room in London, England. So what she did was she surrounded herself completely with her daughter's room. She imagined herself to actually be in the room to the point where she was actually standing in her room. So she got the sensory vividness so strong that she felt like she was actually there. She saw her daughter. Her daughter was standing in her room looking out into the fireplace. All of a sudden, her daughter turns her eyes and looks at the mother. Their eyes meet, and the mother looks at the daughter, and the daughter makes an extremely startled face, like she looked scared, right? So because the daughter was so scared in that moment, it shook the mom like out of that state, and she was back in her living room because she was so scared that her daughter was so scared, seeing her reaction to that. 5 days later, she got a letter from her daughter, which had been written on that exact day where she did this meditation. She got a letter from her daughter saying that she saw her in her living room as if it were real, and she sent the letter, and she was scared because she didn't know, maybe her mom was dead, maybe this was like a vision of her mom coming to her, maybe because she wasn't alive, maybe she was a ghost, like the daughter was scared, right? But on the other end, the mom was sitting there like, I did that. Like, that was me. I'm very much alive and very much impressed with the power of imagination because I transported myself into your room without physically being there, but yet you saw me. So this is a mystical experience where two people experience the same exact thing happening. It wasn't actually happening in this 3D physical world, but yet they were both experiencing it through their imagination. He says, since man is imagination, he must be where he is in imagination. If we take shifting our awareness seriously, there are possibilities beyond belief, right? This is just one example, and there's so many mystical experiences out there that people have like this, and like crazy things happening that shows us that life is not really what it appears to be on the surface if we're just going by physical reality, what we think is real. There is so much more that is real beyond what our physical senses can sense. He says we mustn't restrict ourselves to what we've been taught and conditioned. We can move ourselves by a change in what we're aware of. Our real self, our imagination, is not something that is enclosed within the spatial boundary of the body. It hardly ever crosses our mind that this world is different in essence from what common sense tells us it so obviously is. Looking through the eye not only shifts our consciousness to other parts of this world, but to other worlds as well. Mental traveling has been practiced by awakened men and women since the earliest days of humanity. We need not be dead in order to enjoy spiritual privileges. Sir Arthur Eddington said that all we have a right to say of the external world is that it's a shared experience. Things are more or less real. We can consider something to be real according to the extent which they are capable of being shared with others or with ourselves at another time. And Neville's saying that if this is what real is, that real means a shared experience, then this experience with the mother and daughter is real because both of them experienced this phenomenon. Chapter 9 is called Enter Into. Imagination does nothing until we enter into the image of the wish fulfilled. The secret of creation is first desiring and then assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled. What the world looks like depends entirely on where man is when he makes his observation, and man, being all imagination, must be where he is in imagination. Unless the individual imagines himself, someone else, or somewhere else, the present conditions and circumstances of his life will continue in being and his problems will reoccur, for all events renew themselves from his constant images. By him they were made, by him they continue in being, and by him they can cease to be. Chapter 10 is called Things Which Do Not Appear. To refuse to recognize the creative power of man's invisible imaginal activity is too great to be argued with. Man, through his imaginal activity, literally calls into existence the things that do not exist. It is for us to assemble the images of happy outcomes and then keep from interfering. Events must not be forced, but allowed to happen. All imaginative men and women are forever casting forth enchantments. Any change in the imaginal activity must result in a corresponding change in form. If only we persist in our ideal imaginal activity and do not let the lesser satisfaction suffice, ours shall be the victory. It is useless to hold to standards that we do not apply. It is fatally easy to make the acceptance of imaginal faith a substitute for living by it. Chapter 11 is called The Potter. Now, again, by potter, he just means imagination. The only reason that people do not believe in this identity that God is human imagination is because they are unwilling to assume the responsibility for their frightful misuse of imagination. The 8th Psalm says that man was made a little lower than God, not a little lower than the angels. He says that the angels are actually man's servants, not his superiors. And I know that from studying Kabbalah, that Kabbalah says that man creates and destroys angels with his words and with his actions. Imagination is the real man and is one with God. Imagination creates, conserves, and transforms. Imagination is radically creative when all imaginative activity is fed with images supplied mainly by memory. Imagination is transformative when it varies a theme already in being, when it mentally alters a fact of life, when it leaves the fact out of the remembered experience or puts something in its place. Examine yourself to see whether you are holding to your faith. Test yourself, because God exists in all man, in every single human. He is not our virtue, but our real selves, our imagination. The purpose of life is the creative realization of our desires. Our inner actions must correspond to the actions we would physically perform after these things should be. The world is our clay, and our imagination is the potter. Chapter 12 is called Attitudes. He says, memory, although faulty, is adequate to the call for sameness. If we remember another as we would have known him, we will recreate him in that same image, and the past will be recognized in the present. Imagination always creates reality. If there's room for improvement, then we should always reconstruct him with the new content, visualize the person that we are visualizing as we would like him to be, rather than have him bear the burden of our past memory of him. Our memory of another either furthers him or hinders him, and makes his upward or downward way easier and swifter. Don't rob others of their ability to be great. Think of people in their best ways and construct a scene of amazingness, right? Chapter 13 is called All Trivia. We must use our imagination to achieve particular ends, even if the ends are all trivia. Trivias are like the little things or details or things that seem insignificant. He says, because men do not clearly define and imagine particular ends, the results are uncertain, while they might be perfectly certain if we were to be clear about the end. The bigness or littleness of the object to be created is not in and of itself important, right? So basically he's saying here, whether you want to manifest something huge, big, massive thing in life, or like a very little thing, like you see a cute hat in the store and you want to manifest that, or you want to get a parking spot, right? These are seemingly little things, which Neville Goddard, by the way, calls these seemingly little things toys. But he says they're all important because of the clear imaginal images that created the toys. It's because we are so clear about what we want, that's why we get them. And by manifesting these little things, or these toys, as Neville says, is really great because first of all, you're super lighthearted about it. You don't have so much resistance towards it that it's easy to manifest. But also because when you manifest these little things, you strengthen your belief in the law working. So when it comes to the big things, you have less resistance because you know the law works. You've tested it out on the little things to the point where you now know your power, you know how strong you are in your ability to create the big things. But in terms of the actual law, there's no difference between big and little things. The only difference is the amount of resistance you have towards it because you think it's a big thing. So you seem to create more barriers for yourself to realizing your desire, when in reality, it's the same process for big and little things. In my opinion, we should make all of our goals lighthearted and fun and like an experiment so that we can take the resistance out of it and just purely put our focus on testing the law, creating a life that we love, feeling lighthearted. And by feeling lighthearted too, we're making ourselves feel natural. Like, this is just my life. Yeah, this is just my life. Yeah, I can just have these things. Yeah, I just love myself. I love my life, and everything is wonderful in my life because I have all the things I desire. Like, that is such a lighthearted attitude. And when we adopt this attitude, things will flow into our life so much quicker because we're not so needy and desperate for the thing because we feel like we are the thing, we have the thing, this is just our life, you know? Chapter 14 is called The Creative Moment. In 1 Corinthians 2:14, it says, "The natural man does not receive the gifts of the Spirit of God, for they are spiritually discerned." Whenever we imagine things as they ought to be rather than as they seem to be, that is the moment. For in that moment, the spiritual man's work is done, and all great events of time start forth to mold a world in harmony with that moment's altered pattern. Blake writes that Satan is a reactor, okay? He never acts, only reacts. And if our attitude to the happenings in our day is reactionary, are we not playing Satan's part? Now, I really resonate with this because you guys know I've been studying Kabbalah for many years, my whole life basically, because my parents were studying it since I was born. And Kabbalah also says this too, that our reactive nature, our reactions to the physical world and the things happening around us, and just that animalistic side of us that just reacts and responds, that is the ego. That is what Kabbalah calls Satan, Satan, whatever you want to call it, this essence of negativity that's constantly bringing us down, this ego aspect of us is not our true self. It's just the reactions that we have to this physical world. He says man is only reacting in his natural or Satan state. He never acts or creates. He only reacts or recreates. The spiritual man acts. For him, anything he wants to do, he can do at once in his imagination. His motto is, the moment is now. I am that now. Nothing stands between man and the fulfillment of his dream but facts, and facts are the creations of imagining. If man changes his imagination, he will change the facts. But here he says, imagination seeks from us something so much deeper and more fundamental than creating things, nothing less than recognizing its own oneness with God, who is man's imagination. Chapter 15, and this is the last chapter of the book, is called The Promise. The promise that Neville Goddard speaks about is a state of inner peace that is achieved when you know that you are one with all that is. So in this chapter, Neville repeats the promise of God, as well as sharing his own mystical experiences that he has. Now, his mystical experiences, without going too much into them, he explains how they have all brought him to accept the truth that literally this world is a stage and God plays all the parts. The purpose of the play is to transform man, the created, into God, the creator. God loves man, his created, and became man in faith that his act of self-commission would transform man, the created, into God, the creator. So basically what he's saying here is super deep, is that the purpose of this world was for God to become man, to forget that he is God, and to remember and become God again. He says that this play begins with the crucifixion of God on man as man and ends with the resurrection of man as God. God becomes as we are, and we may be as he is. When God rises in us, we will be like him and he will be like us. The purpose of life is to be like God. I read a Kabbalah book by Michael Berg called Becoming Like God. I want to reread it, but I remember it's a very similar concept to what he is stating here at the end of his book, which is that our purpose in life is to be like God, to become more God, to express more of our truth, which is the God that lives within us. That is the truth of reality. God has deliberately become a man and has forgotten that he is God, in the hopes that man will eventually rise as God. After God arises in one man, that man will lift others up and remind them of their godly nature. So as soon as one, awakens to the God that lives within him, it doesn't just end there. What happens is this man, or me, you, whoever's watching this video, learning these things, we want to tell others about this stuff, right? We want to lift people up to realize their godly power. Right? We all have the power to be creators. And when you know that power to be a creator, you then create the creator in other people. You awaken that nature within them. So, if you made it to this point of the video, I want you to leave me in the comment section down below a diamond emoji to show me that you have successfully finished watching all of Neville's books. So I expect to see a fire and a diamond emoji in the comment section down below. I want to thank you guys so much for watching this series. Thank you so much for joining me. I really hope that you got value from Neville's series. I really, really enjoyed creating them for you, really being able to study Neville's work, summarize it on my own, create these videos, film these videos, edit these videos. It all really helped me to sink these teachings into my own subconscious, to really reprogram my own mind to remind myself over and over and over again of the law, and really witness such beautiful, amazing things coming into my life from it. I'm still growing, I'm still learning, I'm still implementing these teachings into my own life as well, and I can't wait to share more personal stories, in my experience, my life, how the law has worked in my life, how I integrate Neville's teaching with Kabbalah, with other spiritual teachings that I personally know. If you guys want to join in on the journey, then I would love if you could subscribe down below, leave me a comment letting me know what was the most valuable thing you got from this video. So that's all for me in this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in my next one. Bye. Love you.